Greetings, fifth graders. Today's presentation is about the Mayflower Compact. We've been reading and learning about the Pilgrims, and now it's time to think about more than just their contribution to our country other than Thanksgiving when we all get together and think about the bounty that our country gives us as far as all the good things that we grow and the blessings of our families and things like that. So we're going to talk today about the Mayflower Compact. It's kind of known as the first form of what is known as self-governing, which means that the people were governing or making rules and laws for themselves and making decisions for their own groups on their own without a king or a queen or another type of ruler to do that for them. So this is the first known form of self-governing in the New World other than what the Native Americans were already doing once they got here. So let's take a look at an image here. So the Mayflower Compact was signed on November 11th on board the Mayflower, shortly after the boat came to anchor off of a place called Provincetown Harbor, which was not exactly where they ended up landing and settling. So this image kind of shows one artist's thought about what it would have looked like. You can notice here in this picture that there is a document in one person's hands. That is probably Mr. William Bradford, who was kind of the leader of this little colony, and the others that would have been signing it. You'll notice that while there were women probably present, none of the women actually signed the document. So this is probably Mr. William Bradford holding it. You can see that they look as if almost they might be giving prayers towards it. And that would have been appropriate because this group came here in order to find religious freedom. So again, it was signed on November 11th in 1620, and it was signed by these men while they were still on board the Mayflower. The ship was anchored near Provincetown Harbor, and it was originally written to be temporary, which meant that they weren't going to keep it as their form of government for very long, but they needed it to establish kind of a legal form of government so that they could get a formal permission from what was known as the Council of New England. And that council decided whether or not they could have permission to start a settlement in New England or the New World. Their formal permission actually didn't come, though, until almost a year later in 1621. So this is another image of what it may have looked like the day that they signed it. And you can see the men and the women kind of looking on in the background. Again, the women were there to support their men, and actually it helped the men do a better job of setting up the colony and making relations with the Native Americans, because the Native Americans saw these women here and thought that perhaps this would be a more peaceful group that came to settle. And in fact, they were a more peaceful group than what had happened in Jamestown. So the original document of the Mayflower Compact has been actually lost over time. Some historians think that it may have been a victim in the Revolutionary War, where British soldiers may have burned it to prove a point that they were still in control of the colonies. The first text of it that was published, so printed out in a book, actually happened in London in 1622 in a book called A Relation or Journal of the Beginning and the Proceeding of the English Plantation Settled at Plymouth. in New England. Kind of a long title there. A copy of that book is found in our Library of Congress, actually. A copy, though, of the actual Mayflower Compact, a handwritten version of it, was found in William Bradford's handwritten history that he titled Of Plymouth Plantation. And he finished that book around 1630. And ironically, that it's still in existence is pretty amazing. Then another person named Nathaniel Morton, who was the secretary for the Plymouth colony, so he was a bit in charge of taking notes about what was going on in the colony. He also published William Bradford's journal and history, and along with the earliest known list of the signers of this document. And in Mr. Morton's history, that was published finally in 1669. A list of the signers is also found in another book later on in 1736, where another writer does a whole big history about New England. So lots of places the original signers were found, but we're going to take a look at a scanned copy of Mr. Bradford's journal, and you're going to notice that it's difficult to read because it's in cursive, not to mention some of the letters were used differently at that time. So after a little bit, I'm going to show you what those words would have looked like if we printed them out today. So this is first slide. So again, this was in his book, and it's actually, the actual compact starts about right here. And this first word is in the name of God. Amen. So you can tell that these people were definitely here for religious reasons. They were here to worship God as Christians, and they were here to further their ideas about God in this new land. So you're going to hear a lot of mention of God. So again, this is one of the reasons why people came to this country, for God, glory, and for gold, of course. And these people definitely came for God. Here's some more of the journal. Take a look at that. It's kind of interesting to see the letters. You can see things that look close to what we have here in our language now, but there is definitely some differences. Here, this word right here, that word is politic. And we now spell it with only the C at the end. And here's a final picture of it. So it wasn't a very long document at all. So this is what the first few paragraphs said. And you can see this word is underwritten, and the V is what we now use, a U. They also didn't double the T. And this was not because of misspelling. This is how you actually spelled it at that time. Loyal. This word is sovereign. Lord King James. This would be King James, the same one that the Bible was named after. By the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland King, defender of the faith, and having undertaken for the glory of God, and I'm not even sure what this word should have been, of ye Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant ye first colony in ye northern parts of Virginia. Do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another. And it goes on to talk about how they promise to work together. So some final thoughts about the Mayflower Compact and the importance of it for us today, even today. This document becomes one of the items in which the Constitution of the United States eventually is founded upon. So the founding fathers of our Constitution actually were very familiar with this document, even though they were writing theirs almost 100 years later. The main idea that comes from the Mayflower Compact that you have used probably at some point in your lives, at school even, is that there is this idea of majority rule. So if you're going to take a vote on something and the majority of the people vote to do it or not to do it, then that is what the group of people ends up doing. And people at that time, remember, had come here because the King of England had made his own church and they didn't like it. So the main idea here too is that these people were able to make decisions for themselves and would vote to make these rules to obey. And they all agreed that when they made these decisions as a group, what the majority said, everyone would follow. So that's where our ideas of voting come from, because in our ideas of voting, we elect people based on who receives the majority of the votes. It's the same way that laws are passed today. Whatever law receives a majority of the votes becomes that law and stays that law because the majority of our country votes on it. Or even in the state of Kansas, we vote the same way. The majority of the people voting or the legislator votes, and the majority of the group makes the decisions for our state. And I believe it even probably goes true at the city and at the county level. So it's an interesting thing to think about that these people brought this idea with them clear back in 1620. So that ends today's history lesson. Hope you learned something today. I sure have enjoyed sharing it with you. You may end your video now.